Welcome to the Non-Obvious Insights Show. I'm your host, Rohit Bhargava, and every week I'll go through the hundreds of news sources to curate the most interesting and underappreciated stories that you might have missed. This week, we'll explore the truth about fake news, a virus killing engine hack from Ford, a live streamer that sells millions of dollars every day, and how Twitter might save social media. We're live streaming to Facebook, YouTube, and Periscope, and the show starts right now. Happy Thursday, Non Obvious Nation. I am so excited once again to share with you the most interesting and non obvious stories of the week. And this week, I've been thinking a lot about fake news. We hear the term all the time. Fake news this. Is this fake? Can we believe it? What's trustworthy? What isn't? And this week, I started thinking really about the flip side of fake news, not the fake part, but the news part, and how maybe we don't pay enough attention to what is actually news as opposed to whether it's fake or not. And, the first story of this week that I wanted to share with you kind of talks about that. And it's about something that came from Hassan Minaj, who I'm a big fan of. And he, in his show, The Patriot Act, had a video where he talked about the death of the local news industry. And, I've been guilty of this, I think, in the past, where I haven't really appreciated what is great about local news and why we should even care about it. Because when you turn on the local news, a lot of times you just hear stories that don't seem that relevant, or just somebody stabbing somebody else and somebody killing someone. At least that's what it's like here in the US. And I remember when I was living in Australia, local news used to include like who won the high school volleyball tournament. And it was like all sports related. So like local news is different in different places. But what he was talking about, which I found really interesting, was just how many big stories, like the Catholic Church and the priest scandal, or all sorts of other things, are broken by local news reporters, and how important that is. And as I started thinking about that, I realized that there's so much of our news right now that's basically he said, she said. Tucker Carlson says blah, blah, blah. Rachel Maddow says blah, blah, blah. And so many of these stories, like the problem with them, I think, is we're essentially listening to gossip. And what he calls it, which I love in his show, is high fructose bullshit. And that's kind of what it is. And we get stuck listening to this stuff, and we get desensitized to what actually news is and what it should be. And the end result of that is that what we end up doing is we end up either not realizing what we're doing and what we're paying attention to, or we end up censoring that in some cases. And the next story that I thought was interesting, that I wanted to share, was just about how that gets censored, and an unlikely sort of beneficiary of that, which is Ivanka Trump, complaining that the cancel culture of universities caused her speech that was coming up at a university in Kansas to be canceled. And look, I don't agree with her on a lot of stuff, but the idea that we're on college campuses not allowing certain people to speak just gives them a chance to say, "Look, I'm being censored," right? And one of the things that I remember reading some time ago is about stand-up comedians, and how many of them don't go to college campuses anymore because they're just afraid of having a backlash to something that used to be considered funny, on a comedic stage. And look, I'm not saying that anyone should have a platform to do anything, but the big lesson that I learned, and one of the things I talked about in my email this week, is the way we have to fight back against that, I think, is to choose what to ignore. And I shared a bunch of stories this week, and I didn't include links to them because I didn't want to promote the stories or drive traffic to them, but I did want to talk about them. And I think that we all have this chance to kind of do that a little bit more, because I've often said that the opposite of love isn't hate, because you have to care to hate. The opposite of love is indifference. And maybe if we showed a little more indifference towards some of these stories, we might not hear them all the time. Let me share another story with you. And this is the next one that really captured my attention. And by the way, we're streaming live right now. Please do post a comment. Let me know where you're listening and watching from. If any of these things spark any ideas. And definitely get in touch with me, because I love to hear from you. And last week was so fulfilling because I put out in my email, I talked about the Black Lives Matter movement and just what was happening in the world, and I just put in a note saying, just send me a note. And I got so many emails from so many of you, and it was just such a cool thing to be able to connect with you one on one, because I send this email out to 25,000 people every week, and lots of you seem to read it, but I don't always hear back. In fact, I don't usually hear back, and that's okay. It's not a one-to-one email, but just the fact that I do was really cool. So anyway, please keep that coming. And sorry, to get back to let's get back to this story about Twitter, which I thought was really, really interesting. And the reason why this really got me excited, and I'll say happy. I mean, that's not a reaction I typically have when it comes to Twitter, but it made me happy because what Twitter seems to be moving towards is encouraging you to actually read the stuff you share before you share it. And that is something that maybe we think we do that, but if we looked at our behavior, like maybe we don't always do that. Maybe we think we trust the person who was sharing it first, and so when we reshare it, like it's not that big of a deal. Uh, but read what we share, like read what we post. That is something that we can all do, and that we can choose to do. Um, so let me let me keep rolling. Let's see what we've got next. So next story was something that I really got interested in because it reminded me of a strategy that we used a lot when it came to PR. And the strategy with PR was sometimes you would start a campaign by writing headlines that you wish would be true stories. And then you try and go and get those headlines. And this struck me as just one of those perfect ones where Google's drone delivery, which is something that has a lot of issues. I mean, uh, how should we allow these drones to deliver? Where should they be allowed to deliver? What happens with hacking? Like, there's lots and lots of issues. But when you take Google's drone delivery and put it in the context of delivering library books to kids, like who could be against that? Nobody. It sounds like an awesome thing, and it's like this beautiful PR story. Look, I'm not trying to question the motives there or say that it's evil, but I think that it's interesting that this is how we get a story out there and get adoption to happen. Sometimes we share that story, we share the positive version of it, and maybe that starts to awaken people's minds and say, "Oh, this is maybe not as bad as I thought it was." And it just struck me as kind of a brilliant story to do that. This next story is a program that I'm really excited about, and it's happening tomorrow. So you don't have much time to register, but it's a free virtual event, and it's run by my former colleagues at Ogilvy, Chris Graves, Rory Sutherland, really, really smart guys. And it's all about behavioral science and the idea that we need to get better at understanding human behavior if we're going to be persuasive or persuasive marketers, in our case. But this intersection of creativity and behavioral science. And what I really like about this program is, first of all, they've got some real heavy hitters. I mean, besides Rory Sutherland, who's just brilliant and a really hilarious guy, they've got BJ Fogg, Dan Ariely, um, Kai Wright. I mean, lots and lots of really, really smart people talking about this topic. And it's because it's global, it's going to be, I think, 12 or 14 hours of content straight through, starting at like 2 a.m. Eastern time, my time. So I might be having an early morning tomorrow just to tune in and listen to some of this stuff. But highly recommend it if you have any interest at all in being more persuasive. This should be a great event. So it hasn't happened yet, so I can't say much about the content, but I will tell you that the people who are involved are just really, really smart people. So I can't wait for this one. It's going to be great. The next story that I thought was interesting, and these are all, by the way, stories that came in my email newsletter, which, if you don't get it, you can subscribe easily online. And every Thursday morning, you'll get these interesting stories delivered to your inbox. So you can read them before anyone else, before I talk about them on the show. And on the show, as you know, I talk about these stories, and I also share some insights on stories that I didn't include in the email. So we're going to get to some of those as well. But this one I liked because it was just pointing to how, in a world where we don't have live sports anymore, esports has started to take the place in many ways. And from a branding and marketing point of view, that's offering lots of opportunities for more content. Because I think in sports marketing in particular, there's been a lot of lazy marketing. You put your name on the jersey, you name the stadium. I mean, these are just put your name up there and you're done types of marketing programs. And some marketers do get more creative than that, but with esports, you have all sorts of interesting opportunities to build entire worlds, entire sectors. You can create products that can be sold in the game. I mean, the opportunities for creativity in marketing around esports are huge. And that's what this article kind of talked about. And I thought that was just an interesting one to share. As a marketing guy, I'm already thinking, what's the opportunity for me to start thinking about integrating into some of these esports and maybe doing it before others are thinking about it? Jorge, I see a comment from you, listening from Argentina. Thank you, mucho gusto. I appreciate you. Thanks for tuning in. Um, as a reminder, Asokan, good to see you again. Good evening. Thanks for coming in from India. Uh, we are live streaming right now. If you want to say hi, you can post that on social media. And you can also, if you're watching this on a recorded format, you can also get in touch with me directly by email. And feel free to shoot me an email after the show. Let me know if this sparked any ideas. And once again, make sure you subscribe to the email newsletter so that you get this directly from me. You get the stories directly from me. You can shoot me a note or you can connect over email. So thanks for watching. Thanks for being part of the Non-Obvious Nation. And the next story I wanted to share with you is all about a pretty cool hack that Ford created that they're just releasing in police vehicles right now. But what they've figured out is they can override their software limitation that limits how hot the interior of your car can get. And through this hack, they can allow the interior of your car to get to 132 degrees Fahrenheit or 56 degrees centigrade, I believe. And that is the temperature where most viral contaminants can be killed. So now your car might be a virus killing sort of hot box, or it could be, or if you have a police vehicle right now. But many people are starting to speculate, well, hey, if we had this, maybe like people wouldn't be afraid to rent cars. Maybe they wouldn't be afraid to get into an Uber. So there's potential around this. And I just think it's a really interesting idea, interesting innovation, just in police vehicles again right now, but could be in more. And that's really fascinating. So those are some of the stories from my weekly email. And one of the things that is if you're a subscriber to the weekly email, you get these stories every week. And if you're not, you can definitely subscribe. That's the URL to subscribe, or nonobvious.com/subscribe. Either one, they go to the same place and you can get this email in your inbox every Thursday. But the other thing I want to do is share some stories that I didn't include in the email. And so let's go to the cutting room floor. Let's talk about some of these stories that didn't make it. And one of the things that I have been tracking this week, and this isn't actually a single story, this is multiple stories. But what I've been tracking this week is what have been the effects of all of the protests that happened last week. And more broadly, did they result in any actual changes? And these are just some of the headlines that I've been watching this week that have been really, really powerful in terms of how action is happening. So, Black ad agency professionals calling on agency leaders to bring more Black leadership into this and bring more diversity into the marketing and advertising that they're doing. HBO removing Gone with the Wind to add in discussions of its historical context and bring that back. A Missouri woman about changing the definition of racism, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Cops, the long running show, was recently canceled. And the Grammys are changing some of their categories. And the one that I mentioned that I would talk about a little bit more was this redefinition of racism and talking about the societal elements of racism, which in itself is an interesting move. But the other piece of this that I wanted to call your attention to, because it just got me thinking about a much bigger idea here, is dictionary definitions have traditionally been short because they had to fit so many words into their print editions. But that's no longer the case since so many people use the dictionary online. And it really got me thinking, like, what if the definitions that we've gotten used to for all of these words could be expanded for every word, right? That's a huge undertaking, I know, and something that's even crazy to think about on the scale of it. But really hopeful on that same level, because what it gives us is this chance to think that maybe we had boiled a word down perhaps too far, and maybe we can add more context behind it, maybe we can add more detail behind it. And I just thought that was like an interesting opportunity. And sometimes that's what happens with these stories. Like I see an element that's very much right now, changing the definition of racism, for example, but it leads to a bigger idea, which is what if we added more context to define lots of words that were in the dictionary that were shortened because they had to fit in the print dictionary, but which we don't really need right now, where we don't need them to be shorter, at least. The next story that I thought was just a kind of intriguing that it even happened was a guy who is an amateur photographer. And he took a photo and then he tweaked it in Adobe Lightroom. And when he tweaked it and saved it, one of the color settings caused it to have some sort of error that when you put it as a wallpaper for an Android phone would break your phone, basically like cause your phone to restart and then create an error. And it was an unintentional bug, but it was one of those things that that I was reading about it and thinking, if they don't fix this, like maybe somebody's going to figure out how to turn it into an actual hack, and it's just through the photos and how the photos are read. And there's so much that I don't really get behind the technology of all of this, but it was a reminder to me that these things that we'd learned a long time ago about, like, look, when you get a suspicious email, like, don't click on that link, like, or just don't randomly download photos that you think are cool and stick them as your wallpaper. Like, it was just a reminder that not only do we have to be concerned about that, or at least watch out for that, we should probably teach our kids that too. Because that was something that I remember learning just from like email, because we had way more viruses back then. And now I think spam filtering and all of that has gotten so good that it's not really a daily problem for most of us. And so maybe we kind of forgot about it. But our kids never learned it. And this was just a reminder for me that like maybe I need to bring this back and just talk about it, at least with Rohan and Jaden, to just say like, hey, maybe don't click on that or don't download that photo or whatever it is. So that just sparked an idea, and I figured I'd share that with you. The next, oh, thank you, Kelly. Love that you're here, man. Good to see you. And Kelly's one of our authors too, one of our great Idea Press authors. So awesome to see you. And by the way, we're live streaming here. Keep the comments coming. If you have any questions or thoughts, definitely put them here or shoot me an email afterwards. I know that a lot of you are kind of watching this on the side, multitasking. And so it's nice to hear from you afterwards too. So feel free to shoot me an email at some point later on. It'll be great to see that. So the next story that I thought I'd share with you was from Business Week, and it was about uh, someone called the world's Livestream Queen, um, from China, who can apparently sell anything, and her code name is Via, her like stage name, I guess, and the amount of merchandise in every category, cosmetics, food, like you name it. I mean, she sold like a rocket launch. It's insane. And the scale of it is insane. And this article, if you follow the show notes, and by the way, we're going to post all of the links to all of the articles in the show notes. And if you get the weekly email, then you already have the links for many of these stories. But you can follow any of these stories, read the full story, get all of the details. And this one is really, really interesting. If you do anything where you're trying to sell online, or you're trying to just understand the nature of human behavior and why people buy certain things, this is a great story to read for that. And I highly, highly recommend it. This next story was something that I'd kind of known about just culturally. This idea that Sikhs and gurdwaras, which are the Sikh temples, can feed people in various moments of the day. But this was specifically about how the Sikh community in New York is feeding people during a pandemic and during protests. And the photography in this article was fantastic, and I thought it was just a nice example of kindness, which I think we should find and celebrate more in the world. And this was just one of those examples of that. And the biggest challenge, I think it was telling that the biggest challenge that some of the leaders of the Gurdwara shared that they had is letting more people know that they have food and that they'll feed people. And that's, I mean, if that's your biggest challenge, like that's just a beautiful thing. And I thought this story was nice from that that perspective. So that was definitely one worth sharing, worth reading. Please do kind of find that and share that. And like I said, the photography and that's great. The next big story that was also from Business Week was something that concerned me a little bit, just as somebody who's been an expat, expat being somebody who lives in a country that they're not from for work, usually. And so being an expat, I know that this adds a lot to the business community, having people that come to a different country from a different place to share their insights, to bring their culture. Like this is a big part of business community. And I know that this is a big part of many of our professional lives. And the fact that because of the pandemic and all of these things, there are a lot of people who are saying, look, I need to be closer to family. Like I want to be closer to family. And so they're moving back home. And I got a little concerned about this because I worried that maybe I won't have as many expat colleagues in the future, and that is a loss for any of us, no matter where we live, because we can learn a lot from people who aren't from the culture we are. And so just got me a little worried, and so I felt like I had to share this story. And sometimes I'll share a story because there's a marketing idea behind it, and there's something that I really that captured my imagination. And sometimes it's just something that's on my mind, and I figured I'd share it with you, and just kind of share why I thought it was important. And this was one of those. So, um, so those are our stories for this week. Um, Thank you for tuning in to the Non Obvious Insights show. As you know, you can get access to these stories in an email form by subscribing. There's lots of other content, and what you see up here on screen is the book that I recently released, which is all about virtual meetings and remote work. And you can pick up a copy of that book also by going to nonobvious.com/virtual. So that's the place to get a copy of this book. You can subscribe to the email. You can get a copy of Megatrends, which came out in January. So it's sort of perfect timing. It's all about trends and various things. I share a ton of content on my site through the show and all of these different places. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being part of the show. And I hope to hear from you in the coming days.